Comes in and says,
Yeah, and that, you know,
banning all immigrants. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Visa Vibes. My name is Emily Newman. I'm the managing partner of Reddy Newman Brown, an immigration law firm here in Houston, Texas. With me today is my partner Stephen Brown, and we help companies, professionals, entrepreneurs navigate the complexities of the U.S. immigration process. And today we're going to be talking about travel bans. New hot topic for the Trump administration.
yeah, Emily, good to have you back this week. You know, Ryan stepped in. You know, our guy on NIW, so he was the one to really drive that one. But yeah, travel bans are important, right? Really, during Trump one, used more than any other president. We're going to talk about the different types. And it's in the news. We're expecting some sort of visa or entry, and we'll talk about that, ban coming this week. And we just, we don't have all the details yet. We have some maybe leaks, maybe not. So we figured a lot of people have questions on what they are, what's the impact. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, and because we have an impending one, we think it's probably going to be published before we get this episode out. So maybe
Yes.
all of this will be worthless. But I want to make it clear that until we have the actual wording of an executive order, we can never say for sure who exactly it's going to impact, whether it's all immigrants, just non-immigrants, just permanent resident applicants. There's so many different ways that they can structure this. And I want to go back to kind of an earlier travel ban, one of the first ones we saw under the Trump administration, where he was saying, I'm going to ban all immigrants. That was the leak that came out to the media, and everyone freaked out because in everyone's mind, immigrants means everybody who's from another country, regardless of whether you're a non-immigrant, temporary, or immigrant, which is someone who's applying for the green card. And so people were spending thousands of dollars on plane tickets to try to get back to the U.S. before this ban came in. And then when he finally brought the ban and we saw the executive order, it only applied to people who were applying for the green card at the consulate, immigrants. That's the real definition of immigrants. So when we're talking about banning immigrants, we need to be very careful of our common sense understanding of the word versus the actual immigration definition of the word. But even more so, let's go back even further. Like, how is it that a president can ban immigration? Like, I thought we have a constitution, we have Congress. You give one person the authority to decide who gets to come into the country?
This is a hot topic right now in general, right? And a lot of what President Trump is doing on an immigration enforcement side is the presidential's authority. And on some aspects of the Immigration and Nationality Act, Congress gives broad authority to the president to do certain things within their discretion. And one of these is 212F. And that's where we started seeing all these bans coming about in the first Trump administration. There were some before him. He wasn't the first one to discover 212F, right? But it got a lot of hot topics during the Trump administration. So 212F, states, and I'm going to read it, and I hate just reading on the podcast, but whenever the president finds that the entry of any aliens or any class of aliens into the United States would be detrimental to the interests of the United States, he may by proclamation or for such periods as he shall deem necessary, suspend the entry of all aliens or any class as immigrants or non-immigrants, or impose on the entry of any aliens any restrictions he may deem appropriate. So what does that mean? If the president determines that certain things, certain classifications, certain groups, certain whatever are against the U.S. interest, he has broad discretion to do whatever he wants, banning visas, banning entry, and that's what 212F bestows in the president by Congress.
Yeah, and this has been around since 1952.
Right, so it's not
I think what's different with the Trump administration compared to prior uses is that he was much more broad in, who he's restricting. So when Ronald Reagan used it, it was just for a very small, certain Cuban nationals. When George H.W. Bush used it, it was high-ranking officials of military government of Haiti that were dealing with this 1991 political crisis. Clinton used it to suspend entry of certain terrorists and that sort of thing. It was very small, limited scope. And then all of a sudden, Trump comes in and says, "I'm banning all Muslims."
Yeah, and that,
I'm banning all immigrants, and so that's where the outrage came, because number one is based on religion when we had the Muslim ban. Number two, it's just all immigrants. That's a
Right.
very broad. Like, how are you claiming every single immigrant applicant is against the interests of the United States?
And if you remember, immigrant includes immediate relatives, right? So we were talking spouses of U.S. citizens, included parents of U.S. citizens. So it was the most expansive use of 212F that we've had.
All right. So looking back at some of the way these have come about, we have some that ended up being a visa ban, some that ended up being an entry ban. All of this under 212F. So what's the difference between an entry ban and a visa ban? And is there really any difference?
Yeah, so I do think there is a practical difference. And we'll talk about these more in depth. But an entry ban is going to ban people from entering the U.S. Doesn't matter what documentation they have, if they have a visa, if they have advanced parole. That we look at the Muslim ban. There were a list of countries that President Trump said high terror, likelihood. We're banning all. And this was a week into his administration, the first go around. And it said, we're going to bar entry of all immigrants and non-immigrants from these countries. And so that was an entry ban. They could theoretically get the visa stamp in their passport. I don't think they're processing them, but they could theoretically get it, travel, get on a plane maybe, but then be denied at the port of entry. And I remember a bunch of lawyers at airports, spending the night at airports, trying to help clients with this, because it came out very quickly, and people were on flights, when this happened. A visa ban is the stopping of the issuance of the visa, whether it's a non-immigrant visa or an immigrant visa, at the consulate. And so this is going to stop that whole process. This good example of this, COVID hit 2020. June of 2020, he does an H-1B and an L-1 visa ban, telling consulates, because unemployment, because of yada yada, we're going to stop H-1 and L-1 visa processing. You can't issue them. And it was, 8Js were in there too, but it did not prevent entry if you already had the visa, and there was an exception, right? The national interest exception. So if you qualified, you could still get the visa and come in. So the difference being entry ban, you can't come in no matter what. Visa ban, we're not going to issue the documents, but if you have them, you can come in.
All right. So looking back at the prior Trump administration definitely gives us some insight into what we might see in the future. So we just wanted to quickly go over some of the bans that we dealt with before. And you mentioned the Muslim ban.
Yep.
So it was not a Muslim ban in that they didn't say we're going to ban people who are Muslim. Now, in reality, that's kind of what was planned. That was the purpose of it. But it was certain countries that are Muslim countries were banned. And as you mentioned, even people who had a visa, and if they happened to be outside the U.S. when this went into effect, you can't come in, even though you have a visa. And on top of that, they weren't issuing new visas. So as you mentioned, people were denied entry, families were separated, airports detentions were happening, and there were a lot of protests because this was really the first big thing Trump had done on immigration, and people thought it was religious based, which
right. Yeah,
and
it
was, but
it had some background in it, but it wasn't, just Muslim countries. And it became a term of art because that's how he brought it up, right? But it was Iran, Libya, North Korea, Somalia, Syria, Venezuela, Yemen, and there were a few others that was expansive. But it was easier to call it a Muslim ban than Executive Order 13769, when talking about this. This was later appealed by the Biden administration, of course, but it had a huge impact, but it was a entry ban.
all right, then we had the immigrant visa ban, the one I talked about at the beginning that really scared everyone because they're thinking everybody's an immigrant. He's going to block everyone from coming into the country. Then we get the actual language of the executive order that uses the immigration term of immigrant, which means people who are applying for a green card at the consulate. So this affected mostly family-based immigration because more family-based applicants apply at the consulate for the green card versus employment-based, where most people are already in the U.S. working on a work visa and they're applying for adjustment of status. So it had zero impact on adjustment of status, only impacted people outside the U.S., and they had exceptions actually for immediate relatives and also for healthcare workers, because this was COVID timings. But because of it, we ended up creating this backlog of green card applicants outside the U.S., and people were delayed reunifying with their family. It caused a lot of family separation. And then those that were consular processing of the employment-based green card were left stuck for years, even after this was ended, I think, in February 2021. We're still feeling the effects of it because the consulates have taken this long to recover from COVID and actually begin normal processing times for immigrant visas.
Yeah, and it, this was like, you talk about family members. I mean, you talk to people, I'm trying to get my mother over, my wife over, I'm on a green card or whatever it might be. And it just, that family separation was there. But this is one of those instances where language matters. And people talk about immigrants in the general sense of anybody that comes to the United States is an immigrant. But the term of art in the INA is immigrant, non-immigrant, permanent versus temporary. And I get that a lot on social media. I'll say, hey, we got to protect immigrants. Like, they're not immigrants, they're non-immigrants. I'm like, I got you. Like, I know. But I'm not going to, everybody knows there's terms of art versus what people actually use in real life.
Yeah. Now, another one that really did impact employment-based immigration was the H&L travel ban, which, as you mentioned, it was due to COVID and the economy, recession, and all those things. We always blame immigrants for everything in this country. So immigrants were the ones stealing everyone's jobs. So we're going to stop giving them work visas. But as you mentioned, it only impacted people who did not have a valid visa stamp. It did not impact anyone who was in the U.S. So we could still file applications for H&L visas with USCIS. We had the H-1B lottery that year, so we could do a change of status. From F1, from H4, whatever it was, into H1B. But those people that got the change of status were then stuck in the U.S. Because if they left, they wouldn't be able to get a visa to come back. But they did have these national interest exemptions. It was tied to critical infrastructure. So they had this whole list of critical infrastructure that included the chemical sector, manufacturing, emergency services, agriculture, food, healthcare, long list. And so if the work that you were going to do happened to be in one of those sectors, then you could get this exemption. They actually would add a little notation on your visa stamp that said NIE exemption, proclamation, whatever. And then you were allowed to travel.
I was looking at one the other day. It was a crazy flashback, seeing exempt from 10052.
Yeah, it's so funny how we kind of forgot how bad it was and how much difficulty people had, and we have very short-term memories.
It does. Yeah, no, I mean, we were talking the other day, and there was an immigrant visa ban. I was like, Emily, I don't remember one. It was COVID shut down everything, and I did some research, and there was. And we forget about these things because there was a lot 2020 crazy, especially for immigration, because layoffs, because of these bans, who's in the national interest, what are the consulates even processing to begin with? And so it was crazy.
Yeah, and then we also had, because of COVID, we started having these regional COVID travel bans where if the COVID rate was super high in a certain area or certain countries, they would block the entry of people who had been present in those countries unless you had a national interest exemption as well. So we were just dealing with so many different ways you could block people from coming into the country that we kind of just blacked it all out.
Yeah, and this was, the first time I think a lot of people had heard of the Schengen area. Everybody... It exists. We know it. It's part of Europe. But that was one of the big ones, blocking travel for Europeans coming to the United States. But They kept running numbers. It would update almost weekly based off of how many COVID cases are happening in any one country. And it was, maybe you had a layover in the Schengen area, and they'd be like, no, you can't enter because you had a layover there.
Yeah, people had to quarantine for like 2 weeks.
Yes.
It was crazy. All right, so with all of these different travel bans and the outrage, especially from the initial one, the Muslim ban,
Right.
were they legal? Like, where did all of these stay upheld by courts? Because we're seeing right now with like every single action the Trump administration tries to do, there's a lawsuit and then there's an injunction.
Right.
What was the final result?
And one thing, and I'll take a small tangent. That's not absurd, right? That eventually this is going to all these things right now that are getting litigated and getting injunctions. That's to keep the status quo, and eventually it'll get itself out through the court system. And the Muslim ban was the first big case of 2018, the Supreme Court, so a year in, that dealt with 212F. And this was states challenging the legality of the Muslim ban. Again, we kind of talked about the history, and it was narrow. It was these specific individuals or these government leaders or these opposition leaders. This was large swaths of countries that they were dealing with. And the Supreme Court upheld the Muslim ban. That 212F gives broad authority to the president to have these travel bans with limited judicial oversight. And so this kind of created what followed, right, is the president could do a lot under 212F. And maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but it's the way things are now. And until Congress changes 212F, that's the legality of it.
Yeah, so who gets affected the most by these travel bans? The good thing is it didn't impact U.S. citizens who may be naturalized and were born in some of these countries that had the bans. Didn't impact actual green card holders. And it didn't impact those that had advanced parole based on like a pending 485. So it was basically people who were either from those certain countries and not a green card holder, not a citizen, or people that needed a new visa stamp for those particular visa categories. But overall, the impact was on families. It was on businesses because they couldn't get the workers and the skills they needed, and we couldn't get interview appointments at the consulates, and it definitely had long-term impacts.
Yeah, we had some litigation as a firm that we worked with companies on challenging some of those proclamations in terms of how it impacted, because it was impacting businesses, and they've paid. H-1Bs are short term, like it's functioning as a denial. Obviously, things got worked out. They created the NIE, if I remember right, after some litigation was filed. It wasn't originally there, the national interest exemption. But non-immigrant visa holders really felt the brunt, and then obviously, family separation. There were instances of, I have a H-1B holder in the U.S. and my spouse traveled, went to go get their stamping and now couldn't come in. Especially when we're talking about those area-specific ones. So that's kind of what we wanted to do today, is kind of bring awareness, too, on how this can impact. So when you hear travel ban, you tune in and see how it might impact.
Yeah, and so with the news the last week or so, there's been kind of this draft list of countries been thrown around for a potential new travel ban. Some countries are red, some countries are orange, some countries are yellow. Everyone claims this is just a draft, and we don't know what the final order is going to be, if there is one. But tell us a little bit about these different countries and what it could be.
Yeah, so when you go through this, you have like Emily said, this chart that got leaked late last week, middle of last week. It was 40 something countries, if I remember counting it right. You have a number in red, and that's going to be some sort of visa or entry ban that's total for people from those countries: Afghanistan, Cuba, Iran, Libya, North Korea, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, Venezuela, Yemen. Very similar to the Muslim ban the first go around. All right. Then you have these countries in orange. Nobody really knows what orange means, but maybe some level of enhanced scrutiny, more vetting on a smaller number of countries, and then a larger list of countries, including, places in the Caribbean, right, that I didn't even know were problematic. Pakistan, I didn't know we had, issues as a whole. We're listed in yellow, and that's, hey, in 60 days, we're going to come up with how we're going to handle these. So, the rumor out there is we're going to see that sometime the week of the 20th, and they're going to move quick on this. And again, with 212F and Trump v. Hawaii, somebody's going to challenge it. Somebody's going to, the ACLU, the states, somebody's going to challenge it to try to overturn. You can overturn Supreme Court precedent, but I don't think it'll be successful.
Yeah. All right. So one thing to be aware of with if it's an immigrant visa ban or some sort of block on people who are applying for the green card at the consulate, what we saw from before is how that ultimately impacted the employment-based visa bulletin for green cards. Mm-hmm. So be aware that every different category of the green card has a limited number of green cards available, except for immediate relatives. That's unlimited. They get about 1 million a year. There's no cap on it. But everybody else falls into these different categories. We have a family-based side and an employment-based side. There's a certain number of family-based green cards and a certain number of employment-based green cards. In a given year, if not all of those family-based green cards are used, the following year they spill over to employment-based. So employment-based sometimes gets extra green cards in 1 year. And that's how the October 2020 visa bulletin saw this drastic forward movement for employment-based green cards because of the immigrant visa ban that happened the prior fiscal year. There were 140,000 green cards that went unused in the family-based. And so on October 2020, those became available in employment-based, and it practically doubled the number of employment-based available. So with everyone thinking, wow, we have this list of 40 countries, if this is an immigrant visa ban, this is going to be great for employment-based green cards, particularly backlogged countries like India and China. Do you think that's actually great for them? Are we going to see these big jumps in the visa bulletin if this is an immigrant visa ban?
No, and I'm going to preface with I ran the numbers through ChatGPT because I am not a mathematician. I'm going to add all of them up on Excel here, all right? What we got on so I went back the monthly visa issuance number, immigrant visa issuance numbers for fiscal year 22, 23, 24, and year to date for 25 from Department of State. Ran it into ChatGPT, told it to exempt, categories that aren't going to be impacting any of the visa bulletin. And here's what we came up with. That in those, let's call it 3.5 years, there were 21,622 immigrant visas issued to red countries over the 3.5 years. That's a small number. That's 7,000 per year in the red countries. The orange countries had about 3,829 over the 3.5 years. Yellow, 25,455. If you combine all of these for 3.5 years, it's 31,000. That sounds like a lot, but remember, that's over 3.5 years. So we're really talking about 10,000 per year. That is a small drop in the employment-based, family-based bucket. That if there is any spillover going to employment-based, it might impact EB2 rest of world and maybe move that forward a little bit. Maybe if we get lucky, some EB1. But we're not going to see what we saw in October 2020. Not even close to those numbers. Now, maybe we're wrong. Maybe there's a lot more people that are going to not process this year. But kind of looking at historical data, I wouldn't expect a massive jump forward.
Yeah, and then be aware that when we have this massive jump forward, USCIS takes its sweet time to process the green cards, especially during a Trump administration. And so In that first year, October 2020, 80,000 green cards for employment base were wasted. So of the 140,000 extra we got, only 60,000 actually got used because USCIS took their sweet time. I would expect the same to happen this time around. Now, there was a big outcry when that was happening, and we realized what was going on. We had Congress trying to push USCIS, and so they fixed it the following year, but I don't know if this current USCIS will have the willpower, the efficiency, or the manpower if our DOGE government efficiency is going to be firing a bunch of USCIS officers.
Right.
How are they going to process those? So I don't think it's really...
And the big thing in 2020, October 2020, that was helpful was having massive movement in the filing date that allowed people to get on adjustment of status, that allowed people to get EAD and advanced parole and get off the non-immigrant visas. There's still a backlog of people pending from then.
Yeah.
That even if we see
2025, almost 5 years later, we're still dealing with those October 2020.
Right. So to the extent that there's spillover, it might, let's say there is huge spillover, it's going to help clear out the backlog of what's already filed, more so than accepting a massive amount of new filings like we saw in October 2020. And maybe we're wrong. Nobody can predict the visa bulletin, but looking at the past, I don't anticipate we're going to see the number of 485s filed that we saw in October 2020.
Yeah. All right. So looking ahead, can we have another visa ban? I'd say yes. Yeah. Pretty clear that the Supreme Court said yes, the president does have that power under 212F. So we'll have to see if this list of countries is where it stops, where it starts. Is it going to be more limited? Is it going to be bigger? Is it going to expand? Because what we saw before also is we kind of had an initial ban and then we extended it and then we expanded it to larger groups as things progressed. So just be aware of that. Stay tuned to the news. Try not to overly be worried about it because again, until the actual text comes out, we won't know who it covers and who it doesn't. And many times it doesn't cover people who are in the U.S.
Well, and when does it take effect? And what kind of the hypothetical I want to use is one, look at the H-1B, L-1, J-1 ban. It said, hey, starting on like a week from now. And so there were people coming in before then. But also, remember, Emily, we're seeing President Trump use international negotiation tactics that are not, call it negotiation, whether it's tariffs, whether it's visa bans or threats or whatever, to get something in return. So maybe he says, hey, I'm going to do a visa ban. And then maybe a week later, everything's been worked out. So, I think it's important to just not panic, but stay alert because you do want to act quickly if these are going to be coming out. But, we talk about the immigrant visa ban where people were spending thousands and thousands of dollars to fly in the next morning when they didn't need to.
Yeah. That being said, though, if you are on a temporary visa and you don't have the visa stamp in your passport, you're wanting to travel, we would say don't travel because you never know when you're outside the country if one of these bans is going to come into effect. For people that do have valid visas, travels may be okay as long as you're not from maybe some of these countries on that list because that could be an entry ban, not just a visa ban. But the most important thing is just stay up to date and try not to panic. Get the real information from legitimate sources.
Yeah, and I think we're I think in a little bit different position than we were, right, in 2020. We're ready to, go live very quickly with any of these things. So stay tuned, whether it's the podcast or other, of our firm social media, because lots of things are happening on immigration, and we're going to try to keep people up to date.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us for this podcast, Visa Vibes. We'll be back again in another week with a new topic. If you have any suggestions for topics, please feel free to reach out to us on any of our social media.